All right. Welcome, everybody, back to the afternoon programming for our conference today. We will be starting with the third keynote talk by Dr. Karen Quinn on the topic of evidence-informed recommendations for the treatment of people living with long COVID. I have the pleasure of being able to introduce Dr. Quinn, whom I've gotten to know quite a bit over the last few years, working with him on various long COVID-based initiatives. Dr. Quinn is a general internist and palliative care clinician scientist at the Sinai Health in the Department of Medicine and Institute of Health Policy, Management and Evaluation at the University of Toronto. He is also an adjunct scientist at ICES. His research focuses on using advanced analytic methods and administrative data to improve the recognition and care of people with post-COVID condition. Dr. Quinn co-led the establishment of Canada's National Research Network on Post-COVID-19 Condition and was appointed an expert member of the National Task Force on Post-COVID-19 Condition. He was recently named as a national co-chair of the development of the Clinical Practice Guidelines for the treatment of post-COVID condition in Canada, and his early research success includes over 100 publications and more than $29 million in competitive grant funding. Dr. Quinn was also awarded the Governor General's Gold Medal for Academic Excellence and the John Charles Paolini Prize in Physiology and Medicine. Dr. Quinn also, in between achieving all these successes, also practices medicine. And in fact, he is on service this week, and that is why he cannot be here with us today. And so we wholeheartedly thank Dr. Quinn for taking the time out to be able to speak with us today. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay, and can you see me? Good afternoon, everyone. I'm not sure if you can hear me or see me, but I don't know, Dr. Lamb, if you can maybe just give me a thumbs up on the stage, or somebody can put it in the chat. Oh, there you are.
We can both see and hear you.
Okay. It's a real pleasure to be here this afternoon. I hope you enjoyed your lunch, and I'm really sorry that I can't be there in person. I really, really wanted to be, but as Dr. Lamb indicated, I'm on clinical service, unfortunately. So I have to be in the hospital. I am going to talk to you this afternoon. I'm going to share my screens. I hope you all can see that. I'll just close the Zoom screen there. About evidence-informed recommendations. And these are recommendations that are emerging through my role on the Canadian guidelines for post-COVID condition. And I wanted to take you through some of them today because I think it's really helpful to provide some hope that there are treatments that we are recommending and those that we're not, according to the latest evidence. First, I'll start with a land acknowledgement. So I'm calling from Toronto today, and I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I don't have any formal disclosures other than to say that I receive research salary support in my role as a clinician scientist, both from the Sinai Health Department of Medicine and the University of Toronto. So in the 40 minutes that I'm going to give you this talk, and then we'll have some time for questions, I hope to first and foremost just really give you a better understanding of the detailed and comprehensive process that we go through when we're generating evidence-informed recommendations on care. And then I'm going to go through a couple of examples of some of these recent recommendations that we've posted, both on the prevention side and also on the management side of adults living with post-COVID condition or long COVID. And I want to then finish off by highlighting that there's a lot of really promising and hopeful research on the horizon. And I know it takes longer than we're all hoping for, but the future does look bright, and I wanted to highlight some of that work in Canada that's forthcoming. So As a gross underestimate, probably because testing has disappeared in many jurisdictions, but the current estimates are that we're approaching 1 billion infections with SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19 around the world. And the latest evidence, comes from last year, so I imagine it's even closer to 100% now, is that most Canadians have been infected with the virus. And for those non-believers that think COVID is gone or going away, this infection curve from the Public Health Agency of Ontario, or Public Health Ontario, shows that it really isn't going away. On the far left there, you see the first wave starting back in July 2022 and in the winter of July of 2023, not the first wave of the pandemic, but just from this graph. Then the following year, we saw a large group of infections come through the fall and winter time. And on the far right is where we're at today, with a sharp uprise in COVID cases and COVID hospitalizations. This specifically is showing you people testing positive in hospital, so not everybody in the community, and these numbers will be much higher than that. But it's not going away. You see every year now, it's becoming a seasonal virus where we see large surges in infection. And the recent survey from Statistics Canada and Public Health Agency of Canada estimates that about 1 in 9 Canadian adults have experienced long COVID, or a group of persistent symptoms at the very least that have persisted beyond 3 months. And so I wanted to take you through the Canadian guidelines for the post-COVID condition and the role in which I play as the clinical co-chair for one of the 6 guideline teams that looks at pharmacological and non-pharmacological interventions. And I think before we get into the punchlines of what those recommendations are, I wanted to really help people understand just how thorough and comprehensive and careful a process this is. So this schematic shows you the structure, the roles and the responsibilities of each committee within our guideline team. So there is an overall executive. There is an international collaborative team that reviews all of our recommendations and provides feedback. There's a set of evidence synthesis researchers who do a comprehensive search of the literature to find all relevant studies related to our question. There's a central guideline development group that looks at all recommendations and reviews them to make sure that they're appropriate and aligned with the evidence that was evaluated. There's a knowledge mobilization committee that's working hard to make these recommendations clearly understandable to the public and to understand what these different types of recommendations mean. And on top of that, we have both an equity oversight committee and a public member panel that provides us input and reviews all of our recommendations as well, to ensure that we're really considering all relevant and important elements to these recommendations and whom they might impact either positively or negatively when we're making these recommendations. The other process we use is this very well recognized international society and system called GRADE, which is the grading of recommendations, assessment, development, and evaluation. And it's a system that allows us to rate the certainty of the evidence before us and the strength of our recommendations. And effectively, it's considered the standard, the world standard, the global gold standard in guideline development. Most guideline societies will use the GRADE approach, and we have too. Within GRADE, there's this framework that we call the evidence to decision framework. And it's a really powerful way to take the evidence from the research on the risks and the benefits and all these other domains and allow a panel of experts that includes people with lived experience. In our panel, we have 3 people with lived experience, and turn those into evidence-informed recommendations. So I wanted to highlight the difference between whether a drug works or not as far as a specific outcome, or an intervention works or not, and making a recommendation about whether you should or shouldn't use that intervention based on a variety of domains. And I know this is a very busy schematic, and I will provide these slides to those who wish to look at them. But if you see in this little box here in the middle with these probably tiny little words that you may or may not be able to read from your screen, but there are several domains that we go through and make ratings and judgments on, including the benefits and the harms, but also of how people might value those outcomes. What are the resources required? How much do these interventions cost? Are they cost effectiveness? What are the impacts on equity in our society? What is the perceived acceptability of these interventions, both from the patients who might be using them, but also the providers and the payers in our healthcare system? And what's the feasibility of implementing these types of interventions, if we started to do this tomorrow? So it's a really comprehensive, careful, and robust, high-quality framework that turns what we have from evidence into recommendations that we make and publish. And just so you know, today I'm talking about this middle panel here. We're the third guideline team around pharmacological and non-pharmacological interventions. But there are 6 teams, one on prevention, one on testing and identification and diagnosis, one on specifically neurological and psychiatric topics, an entire team dedicated to pediatric and adolescent topics, and then one that looks at our healthcare systems and social supports. So there are 15 guideline recommendations that are proposed to come from each one of these teams by the end of the calendar year. And that I think equates to about 100 recommendations that we'll be making based on the evidence. So I hope that helps you understand a little bit more about that this is a very comprehensive process. And now I want to take you through some of the recommendations that we make, starting with prevention. So one of the things we do is go through a question prioritization process. And the public and other key interest holders are surveyed, and we get back a huge list of hundreds of questions and topics that are of interest to pretty much anybody who responded to those public calls. And then through a process with our panels and various voting mechanisms and ranking mechanisms, we end up with a final list of 15 questions that are our priority questions to answer. And so this was one of them that we've answered and published on the website. Unfortunately, I'm not permitted to discuss or identify what the coming questions and recommendations are, or the decisions that have been made, until they're in the public domain. But these are publicly available, and I wanted to take you through these to help you understand how we made these recommendations and what these recommendations are. So there's a lot of hype and interest around the use of metformin, which is a drug traditionally used to treat people with diabetes, but has some additional effects that are still being worked out. And there was a major trial that came out and looked at this metformin in preventing post-COVID condition. And the priority question for our group was actually not to look at prevention among people who don't have PCC, which is a different team. Ours was to say, among people with post-COVID condition, should we be prescribing metformin when they have a recurrent COVID infection? And many people now are on their 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and beyond infections from the beginning of the pandemic. So the rationale behind the use of metformin to prevent new or worsening post-COVID is the idea that in experimental conditions, metformin actually shows activity against the virus, SARS-CoV-2, which causes COVID, in both human and other cell human tissue. And we think it works by preventing and reducing inflammation and oxidative stress. And in some of these studies, the people who had earlier exposure to metformin had a larger effect on suppressing inflammation and oxidative stress, which supports an antiviral mechanism as the virus cranks up its numbers of copies and the inflammation that comes from that response. So the other thing we do on top of prioritizing questions is we prioritize outcomes. And so the panel, and including our people with lived experience, we rank outcomes that we think are most important to the least important. And we place heavier weight on the recommendations when the effects, in this case, desirable effects, are beneficial to those priority outcomes, as opposed to some of the other less important, potentially surrogate outcomes. And so for this question, we looked at the incidence of post-COVID, so the number of new cases of post-COVID condition, the effect on quality of life. And in some studies, we don't actually have a direct measure of quality of life, so we use a surrogate outcome from the trials. In this case, the presence of hypoxia, which was felt, so low oxygen levels, which was felt to impair somebody's quality of life because they're not able to breathe or they need, supplementary oxygen all the time. And lastly, another quality of life surrogate was the number of times people are going to the hospital or the emergency department, again, as a reflection of people just don't want to spend their time there, and that would negatively impact their quality of life. So what we found from the collective evidence that we were synthesized was that there were 41 fewer people per 1,000 who developed long COVID when treated with metformin, 11 fewer people per 1,000 who had hypoxia, and 20 fewer people per 1,000 who had visits to the emergency department and hospital. So when we look at the undesirable effects, often thought of as the side effects of a drug, you have adverse events, AEs, and serious adverse events. And these are sort of clinical trial terms, but effectively, adverse events are more milder side effects. So maybe you have some gastrointestinal upset or you have other types of, limited reactions. And serious adverse events are much more serious. You land in hospital because of a drug, you die because of the drug, you can't take the drug anymore because it's causing some serious side effects. And we saw here that there were, on a percentage basis, 0.5% more of the population experienced adverse effects from metformin than placebo, and similarly 0.4% of serious adverse events. And what ends up happening when we go through each one of those domains that I outlined at the beginning is that we have this summary of judgments table that displays a summary of all the judgments the panel has made once we've carefully gone through each domain. So they get a sort of a better holistic sense. So this is the one from metformin where you see, yes, it's a priority problem because we went through that priority process. The desirable effects were rated small, and we have thresholds for the magnitude of those effects that we apply to our judgments. The undesirable effects were deemed to be trivial, and all of these different domains that I'm not going to just read out for you here are available on the websites as well with these recommendations. And so ultimately, based on the beneficial, desirable effects, trivial, undesirable effects, and all of the other domains, the CAN-PCC recommends that people who have post-COVID condition and have a new or recurrent COVID infection, that they use metformin. Now, this is a conditional recommendation, and I'll explain to you what that means at the end. And there's very low certainty in the evidence. So one of the approaches that GRADE does is it rates how certain we are. And because a lot of these studies are not directly in people with post-COVID condition and are not necessarily directly randomized clinical trials to tell us the truth, we don't have a lot of certainty on the judgments that we made. And so we communicate that. But in the end, the collective evidence suggests that metformin may be beneficial. And one of the other things we do to try to help the healthcare providers and family physicians who are really going to be the ones who are looking after patients with new infections is to tell them the dosing regimens that were used in the evidence that was evaluated for this recommendation. And so for metformin, for example, there are two different dosing regimens. One where people receive 750 milligrams twice a day for a total of 10 days, and one where there's sort of a titration of the dose over 14 days to try to minimize some of the gastrointestinal side effects that metformin have. Oops. So the second question we looked at around prevention is looking at selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And I know this made a big splash in the media when some of these studies were coming out about identifying that people with post-COVID condition had lower levels of serotonin. And so I wanted to highlight this and a recommendation that we made on the evidence. So the rationale behind this question is that serotonin is a neurotransmitter. So it's a type of chemical or hormone in the brain. It's mainly produced in the gut, actually. So most of it, 90%, your gut produces, and a small proportion is produced in the brain. And as I said, those studies show that its production is disrupted by COVID-19 infection. The effects of serotonin, it has lots of different effects on us, on our mood, on our cognition, on our sleep, appetite, and gastrointestinal function. Many of the things that are disrupted and disturbed in people with long COVID. It also has modulatory effects on our immune response and our autonomic nervous system. Again, many things that appear to be affected in long COVID. So there was lots of biological rationale to look at this drug classes to see if they're of any benefit. And what we found from the evidence that was available is that when you treat people with serotonin reuptake inhibitors, there's 230 fewer people per thousand that have anxiety. There's lower rates of insomnia, lower rates of cognitive impairment, and lower rates of fatigue. However, when we looked at the incidence of post-COVID condition, people who were treated with serotonin reuptake inhibitors, there was a higher incidence of post-COVID condition in people taking the drug compared to people taking the placebo. And what we did here on the right is we modeled the numbers at different prevalences of post-COVID condition. So if you assumed that there were about 74 people per thousand who would get new post-COVID condition, that would be 27 more cases of post-COVID per thousand when you're treating with selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. If you do that at lower prevalence or lower incidence, 21 per thousand, then your number overall is lower at 8. And if you do it at higher, at 100, so that's about a 10% incidence, then you get 36 more cases per of long COVID when you treat with serotonin reuptake inhibitors than when you don't. Similarly, we found the same effects for cognitive impairment with 28 more cases of cognitive impairment per thousand. So those were deemed, significant undesirable effects. So again, when we looked at the totality of the evidence across all of the judgments, those desirable effects were deemed to be small but important. However, the undesirable effects were moderate in magnitude. There is, some variable effect on equity because people have to pay for these drugs and they may or may not have coverage. It probably is not an acceptable intervention if people are aware that it increases the risk of post-COVID condition and cognitive impairment. It's a very feasible thing to do it's already prescribed widely for other mental health conditions. The first team, the guideline team that was looking at this, actually added another domain that they're studying in guideline development on planetary health impacts, which we thought was quite interesting. But unfortunately for this, there's no included studies. So the panel and the collaborative, and the end of a review after all of that evidence and the differential effects across different domains, made a recommendation against the use of these selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors for people who have acute COVID infection. So these people do not have long COVID, but they do have an acute COVID infection, and it's not going to help in preventing post-COVID condition. Again, a very low certainty in that evidence and leading to a conditional recommendation. The next question we looked at was whether antihistamines should be used for people with post-COVID condition. Antihistamines are things like Reactin, cetirizine, Benadryl, diphenhydramine, so commonly used medications. It's definitely questions that my patients ask me all the time. And the rationale behind this is that many people with post-COVID condition report symptoms that are suggestive of this particular condition called mast cell activation syndrome. And so this is why people are, I think, so interested in looking at whether these drugs help or not. And in expert consensus that I was a part of, and also with Dr. Lamb and others, we suggest in that, based on expert opinion, that a trial of antihistamines might be reasonable. But we really don't know from a careful review of the evidence whether they actually would help or not. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I think it's just important to recognize that mast cell activation syndrome is not a common condition, and many, many people and healthcare providers are not familiar with it or its symptoms. So we're trying to also help educate society about what the symptoms are. So when people come to you, you might say, oh, you have a collection of these symptoms. You fit this syndrome. And effectively, mast cell activation syndrome is when you have evidence of two organ systems, and that's like, your skin, your lung, your gastrointestinal system, or your cardiovascular system. And you have you can have in combination these other constitutional symptoms like fatigue and difficulty concentrating, but those alone are not capable of making a diagnosis of mast cell activation syndrome. So when we looked at the desirable effects, and here the trials are reporting a mean difference on that x-axis, we see some improvements in symptoms related to mast cell activation syndrome, itchiness or pruritus, and there's actually a quality of life scale called the itchy quality of life. There's an improved quality of life. There's an improved quality of life if you're looking at depression as a surrogate for quality of life, anxiety as a surrogate, and cognitive impairment as well when people are treated with antihistamines compared to not. As far as the undesirable effects, these antihistamines are relatively benign drugs with very few side effects. There are some undesirable effects. However, we found that there were 40 fewer undesirable effects among people who were treated with antihistamines, and there were no serious adverse events. So there's no bars there. So again, there's the summary of the judgments. You have a small desirable effect, trivial undesirable effect, and other impacts across these different domains. And in the end, what we did was split this recommendation into two. So in adults with post-COVID condition who have and are displaying signs and symptoms that might be compatible with mast cell activation syndrome, even if they're not meeting the specific diagnosis for that condition, because it can be quite challenging to actually diagnose MCAS, we recommend using antihistamines in a trial to see if it helps. And again, these were the specific two antihistamines that were used in the trials. And for the providers, we also give the class, there's different types of receptor antagonists so that they can translate those to ones that are more commonly available in their region. However, it wouldn't make sense to treat somebody who doesn't have these symptoms with an antihistamine to try to fix symptoms that are not present. So we specifically said if your patient does not have signs or symptoms of MCAS, then we wouldn't recommend using antihistamines. All of those recommendations are conditional and, again, very low certainty. The last one I wanted to review with you, which was quite controversial, was the use of low-dose naltrexone in people with post-COVID-19 condition. Another one that was widely reviewed in the media, and certainly I get asked about all the time. And the rationale behind this is that low-dose naltrexone is a pain medicine that's also believed to have immunomodulatory effects and reducing inflammation and potentially neuroinflammation specifically. And it may also help stabilize the autonomic nervous system, so people with dysautonomia may benefit from it. And certainly from studies in people with ME/CFS previously, there was some suggestion of benefit. So here we looked at the desirable effects of low-dose naltrexone. And we see pretty well, almost no benefits. There's a small improvement in quality of life, but really no change in physical functioning, pain, or fatigue among these prioritized outcomes. There are very few side effects for low-dose naltrexone, and in fact, we saw 21 fewer adverse events in people who took it compared to those who didn't, and no risk of mortality in taking low-dose naltrexone. So the summary of judgments for this one was that there really was no desirable and no undesirable effects. So there was the balance of those effects that wasn't favoring one side or the other. There are moderate costs, however, associated with getting low-dose naltrexone. It's not readily manufactured in its current dosing, and you have to find a specialized compounding pharmacy, of which there's only a few around, to be able to get it specifically compounded. So that would reduce equity, and it is not very feasible in our current healthcare system to get. So based on those lack of benefits, plus all of the other domains around difficulty acquiring and the costs from acquiring low-dose naltrexone, the collaborative suggests against using low-dose naltrexone in people with post-COVID condition. Again, conditional, and again, very low certainty in the evidence. So those are four of I think there are now 17 on the website, and I'll show you where to find them in a minute. But I wanted to spend a couple seconds here just explaining to you what a conditional recommendation means, because there's a lot of, I think, misunderstanding or lack of awareness of what that means, not just amongst the public, but also amongst my colleagues, physician colleagues, and other healthcare providers. So this slide takes you through what it means for the different levels of people affected by it. But ultimately, a conditional recommendation means people can still take the drug if they wish, if we're recommending against it, for example. And it requires a careful discussion with the person and their healthcare provider to decide if it's right for them. But it absolutely does not mean do not take low-dose naltrexone, because we're so uncertain in the strength of that recommendation, and it's based on low certainty evidence that we couldn't possibly tell people that it would absolutely may not work for them. So that is what the meaning of a conditional recommendation means, and our knowledge mobilization team is trying to their hardest to make that clear and apparent to healthcare providers and patients across our society. So if you want to learn more and you want to stay up to date, here's the website, the URL in red below. We have a batch of new recommendations released every month, and we try to put them out on Twitter, and there's an email server if people want to join that and sign up on the website. But you can also just go to the website yourself and look up the guidelines as they're released each and every month. And there's one additional resource that actually just came to my attention today that I looked at this afternoon, and I thought, wow, this is really helpful for providers and for patients out there. And it comes from the Center for Effective Practice. And it was a spearheaded by several of my colleagues, but with Ontario Health and the Ministry of Health and other government agencies to try to help providers understand the symptoms, the diagnosis, and the treatments of different conditions that you see here. And I've highlighted POTS because POTS is very common in patients that I see, at least with long COVID. And so there's some helpful resources on there on the diagnosis and treatment of POTS. So I'm going to finish by just pointing to some hope on the horizon. If you're not familiar with research, it is a slow and difficult process, but it's important that we take our time and we do things carefully so that the end result, we can trust the results and know how to help people. So there are several Canadian-led clinical trials, some of which are ongoing and some which are close to launching, that I just wanted to highlight so that everyone's aware that there's a ton of work going on across Canada by incredibly smart people and dedicated, passionate people that are here trying to help those with long COVID. So first is one of my mentors, Angela Chung. She's been leading the RECLAIM trial, and I've been helping lead that at Mount Sinai as part of one of the sites. This is what's called a pragmatic, prospective, adaptive randomized trial. It's a platform trial as well, and so we test more than one drug at the same time or one intervention at the same time. And in doing so, we accelerate our ability to find which treatments work, and the ones that aren't working, they get kicked out of the trial so that we're not wasting precious resources on drugs that are of no benefit. That's the adaptive nature of a platform trial. To date, they've enrolled 365 participants, and so we're really appreciative of people who are willing to participate. And it's great to watch this kind of science evolve. Andrew Pinto at Unity Health in Toronto is also leading the CANTREAT COVID trial. This is looking at Paxlovid in the prevention of long COVID in people who aren't hospitalized, so people as outpatients who test positive or have symptoms highly suggestive of COVID-19. And they've enrolled just over 700 people to date. So hopefully we'll have some improved and up-to-date evidence on whether Paxlovid really does prevent long COVID to build the evidence base from what we're making our recommendations on and around these drugs. I wouldn't include myself as the smartest in this group, but I did want to highlight that we are probably a few days, if not a couple of weeks away from launching our own trial at Sinai and across Ontario that looks at Paxlovid or remdesivir, so the role of antivirals to prevent long-term cardiovascular sequelae. So rather than looking at symptoms, we're looking at the development of new chronic health conditions that negatively affect people's quality of life and often land them in hospital. So that will be forthcoming. As part of the Reclaim trial platform, Lawrence Richer is launching a taurine supplementation and looking at that as a novel therapeutic approach to treat neurocognitive symptoms in people with long COVID. And there's lots of really great evidence from our long COVID web about taurine supplementation as a promising intervention. Heighten Naik has published his protocol, and they were funded through a recent CIHR round of funding to look at low-dose naltrexone. So we're really excited for this trial because we don't have direct evidence in people with post-COVID for this drug, hence the low certainty of our recommendation. And we're hoping with the success of this trial, we'll be able to further understand whether low-dose naltrexone actually helps or doesn't help in people with post-COVID condition. Pavlos Bobos at Western got funded for his prefacer trial. He's a physiotherapist and looking at different rehabilitation interventions, and they've developed this novel one called COVIDX in a way to treat fatigue in people who are outpatients receiving rehabilitation for post-COVID condition. And Ian Patterson is looking at new types of diabetes drugs. This one's called dapagliflozin. It's a type of drug called an SGLT2 inhibitor that has all sorts of promising effects. And we look forward to his trial in treating people with long COVID syndrome. So just to summarize and finish off, there are several evidence-informed recommendations that have been published on the website. The ones I reviewed for you today because they were really prominent in the news, or they're very commonly asked among myself and my colleagues who treat people with post-COVID condition. We recommend metformin in the prevention of post-COVID condition and recurrent infection among people with post-COVID condition. We recommend trials of antihistamines among people with post-COVID condition to treat symptoms suggestive of mast cell activation syndrome. But we do not recommend the use of selective serotonin or norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors in the prevention of PCC in people without post-COVID condition. And we do not recommend the use of low-dose naltrexone at the present time in the treatment of post-COVID condition. But I think what's really exciting for me as a clinician scientist, both from the clinical care side and the research side, is that there are, as I just outlined to you, several, and apologies if there are others out there that I missed in Canada, but there are several clinical trials that are forthcoming that will really advance the state of knowledge and treatment to help people around the world. So there's just several people that, that I really wanted to thank for all of their help. And there are so many others that I can't even list here that have put their time and energy and sweat and blood and tears into this work. And just a few people I wanted to highlight for you today. I'm always happy to answer questions via email or clarify things further on how recommendations were made, because I think it's really important that people understand how we make these recommendations and the processes by which they're done. So there's my email address. So please feel free to reach out and contact me. And I really appreciate your attention. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here this afternoon, at least virtually. I wish I could be there in person, but thank you to the organizers for such an incredible symposium and for having me present these results here today. I'm going to stop sharing and open the floor for questions.
Thanks so much, Dr. Quinn. So as we have been doing, we invite those in attendance to step up to the podium to ask your questions, or just raise your hand and the floater will come by with the mic. So to kick things off, I'll ask Susan maybe to read off some online questions.
Thank you. Hi, Karen. Lovely presentation. Thank you.
Thanks.
So some questions that are on HUVA, and I think it might be nice if you're able to take a bit of time later today to have a look at the HUVA questions. There might be some that could be very quickly answered.
For sure.
We may not have time for all of them today. So one question is around recognizing and incorporating the work of interventions of naturopathic medicine. Perhaps you can talk about that in terms of the guideline development and the source of evidence.
Absolutely. Naturopathic medicine, I think, is an important complement to our, what we might call traditional Western medicines. And certainly all of us on the panels are interested in learning more and exploring those and looking at the evidence for them. In fact, many of those were proposed from our public consultation and consultation with our guideline teams as potential priority questions. The biggest problem is that there is just no evidence. There have been very few clinical trials looking at different supplements or different types of naturopathic interventions. So it leaves us with no evidence base to evaluate whether they work or not. There were a few different types of supplement trials that do exist. The problem is they're combinations of like 5 or 6 different supplements or vitamins. And so it's like we can evaluate, from one trial, does that specific combination work or not? But we're not able to say, does taurine on its own, does nattokinase on its own? We don't have the evidence out there. So I think one of the biggest research priorities, and as I was happy to point out, taurine is one that's actually has a clinical trial forthcoming. But one of the biggest research priorities is that we need to study these naturopathic interventions, because I think there's a lot that might work, and we just need to establish the evidence base to determine that. But thank you for that question. I think it's really important.
All right, so I'm not seeing any in-person questions, so maybe I'll pass it to Susan for another from the online community.
Great, thank you. Were any of the studies on metformin done on a population who already had long COVID?
Yeah, unfortunately not. I am unaware of any recent publications either. So it's a really challenging work that I've really opened my eyes to how difficult it is to make these guideline recommendations. And certainly we do not take them lightly. There's a lot of debate, often very spirited amongst us, to get it right. So in the absence of what we call direct evidence, and direct evidence is where an intervention is studied in the population that you are interested in this case, people with post-COVID condition, we have to use indirect evidence, which is the best that we have at the current time to help us answer those questions. And so there was the most probably well-known study was a trial that looked at metformin. It also looked at fluvoxamine and ivermectin in treatment of acute COVID, and then looked at sort of long-term outcomes. In that trial, helped form the evidence base for the metformin recommendations. But as I said, we don't have any direct evidence. And so what happens as a result of that is we rate down the certainty. They get penalized on the certainty of the evidence when you don't have direct populations. So we make our recommendations and we say it can't be a strong recommendation because we have very low certainty in the evidence. So we make a conditional recommendation and state that we have very low certainty in the evidence to be more transparent about the evidence that's underlying it all. And so I hope that answers your question, but another really important one. Thank you.
Yeah, and then just to add to that, in the primary study, I was the study inclusion criteria was an acute infection, and so it's very possible that the part of those patients that enrolled in that study had long COVID, but it just was not a question that was included or part of the study, so we couldn't even try to extract that information out after the fact, and doing subgroup analysis as a reader. So I think that's part of the limited information there that Dr. Quinn was talking about. Yeah.
Keep going?
Susan, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So there's a few comments from personal perspectives where they've found low-dose naltrexone helpful. And the question perhaps that you could provide some input on is, how did it become so popular or talked about in online long COVID communities given the lack of evidence?
Yeah. The short answer is I don't know. I think maybe read Malcolm Gladwell's book on tipping points and how things just become really popular. But I think it reflects, to me at least, the desperation that we all feel in lack of proven treatments that we have to really truly help people with long COVID. And that's why we formed this national research network, is because our vision is a world without long COVID. And we need to advocate for research funding to be able to do these trials to prove which treatments do and do not work. I think when people find promise, and some of the MECFS literature had, some slight signals that it might help in that population, people are desperate to grab at something and say, maybe this will work for me. And certainly when people take drugs, they might feel better. And sometimes it might be that the drug actually helped them, or there might be a placebo effect. But the reason you need these carefully done clinical trials is because they actually allow you to understand and know whether the drug truly or truly does not work. I think that's probably why it's become so many of these interventions are so widely promoted on online communities, because it just reflects the desperation that people feel. And I think it's really a call to action from all of us that we need to continue to do this research, and we need dollars to back that up. And we keep fighting for it every year with our different grant submissions, and hopefully people continue to find this to be an important issue and fund our research.
Thanks so much. We've got a couple of questions for the in-person attendees. Go ahead.
Hi, Karen. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I'm a parent of a teen who lives with long COVID for almost 4 years now. I also had the privilege to talk to Dr. Robbie, and this was a concern, and I talk in behalf of all the families across the country. The most recent draft recommendation that came out was related to the mental health and depression screening for families with children with long COVID. One of the big concerns that we had was the decision table evidence that was attached with the draft recommendation that really focused mainly on the post-pandemic effects of how children are feeling versus actually talking about children who actually have the condition. So I think there's a very big gap between what the evidence is being reviewed at that level of the guideline committee versus what is actually happening on the ground. So I'd really like you to comment on that, because we're very concerned that a lot of the families are being diagnosed or, kind of projected towards that mental health realm and the somatic realm. With this kind of recommendation coming out or being considered, it might get even worse. So, that's one of the big concerns that we are having now as across the country. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I'm a parent of 3. I'm fortunate that my three young ones don't have post-COVID condition, but as a parent, I can feel for the despair and the desperation that parents with kids with long COVID must feel. And so, I mean, I first and foremost, I just want to say that my heart goes out to those families. And I'm hoping that we can, discover new treatments for kids and adolescents as well as adults. I think what you've highlighted, and it is intended to be transparent, that when we publish these evidence to decision frameworks, and the evidence, that the studies that underpin them, they're not perfect. It is an imperfect science that we have, but it's the best evidence and information and data that we have at this time. In the future, these evidence-informed recommendations can be updated and should be updated when there's emerging evidence that is better and higher quality and more in a direct population. So I think you've perfectly highlighted that the challenges that we face on a guideline panel when we're trying to interpret this and come up with a recommendation, including the potential downstream effects that these recommendations might have on clinical practice and care. I think part of the spirit of that recommendation, and it did not come from my specific guideline team, so I wasn't privy to the nuanced discussions, but I think part of that recommendation is reflective of the prevalence of depression and anxiety and other mental health conditions, not as a cause of long COVID or not in place of long COVID, but as a coexisting condition with long COVID, in addition to how widely prevalent it's becoming post-pandemic. So I think the idea to screen for mental health conditions, especially in youth and adolescents, because the prevalence seems to be so much higher after the pandemic, is really important. And we know that people who suffer with chronic conditions like post-COVID condition have higher rates of depression, anxiety, and other mental health disorders, probably because of a consequence of those conditions. And I think it's really important that we as healthcare providers have a holistic view of our patients and try to help them in every way we can. I recognize your concerns, and all I can say is I certainly hope that it doesn't translate to the fears that you've expressed. And I think our knowledge mobilization teams will be working hard to try to educate healthcare providers to ensure that doesn't happen.
Thanks for that very detailed answer. We have another question in person.
Karen, that was a great talk, and it's concrete hope. So we need that. We are desperate. Talking about the depression screening, I would ask that you please put in dead plain language, but do not stop there. Keep investigating for other long COVID issues, because many physicians in Canada do not have French or English as a first language, and tact or doctor speak is going to give them an out to just say, well, obviously you're nuts. I'll give you an SSRI and you go home and, we'll check on you in 6 months. When you've still lost your life. The low-dose naltrexone one, we talk amongst ourselves. There's a group of 20,000 of us. And why do you think we're not using ivermectin? Because we know it doesn't work. And we can find studies that show it doesn't work. But we've also, in the very early days, people said, oh, it made me sick as a dog and did nothing. Before there was even scientific review of it. The low-dose naltrexone seems to help about half who use it, and it gives them back from being bedridden to being able to be up for a few hours, from not being able to drive a car to being able to drive to nearby things. It gives back a huge quality of life to half the people who use it. And to now have our physicians who are incredibly reluctant to prescribe it. Mine took a year. My husband's took 6 months. And it makes such a radical change and placebo effect. We knew it would take 2 weeks to have any effect. And within 2 days, we had a marked effect. That's not placebo effect. So this is a time when it would be very good to listen to patients, because if physicians and quality researchers don't, you drive us into the arms of compassionate charlatans. Again, thank you for what you're doing. Thank you to Robbie for all the time he spent explaining the realities of a Cochrane review to me and your limitations and strengths. But this is one, I'm afraid, where you got it wrong, and if the rule is first do no harm, you have to change this. Either say nothing about low-dose naltrexone or just say it's neutral. Please do not recommend against it, because our doctors, my GP has 2,000 patients and says I'm his only long COVID patient. So he hasn't got time to go and research long COVID issues. And he'll just thumb through the Cochrane review and it says, no, don't give it. Yeah. So it's going to harm us. Half of us will not have a chance to get a bit better while we wait for better treatments. So that's my plea. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorraine. I can appreciate your advocacy. I think the response I have is the following. The evidence that we evaluated before us does not demonstrate a benefit. It's imperfect evidence. And we struggled with this recommendation a lot because of the anecdotal stories that you're sharing. And, I think when you say that there's a community of 20,000 people and half of them are anecdotally saying that things are getting better, that's an impetus to do a clinical trial. That's where you're saying, well, the evidence is imperfect, but we hear a lot that it's working, so we should do this and study this properly. And thankfully, Dr. Nayak has a trial that's studying that. And we included language specifically in the recommendation that says this should be reevaluated at the successful completion of that clinical trial and others if they exist, because we will be able to update the recommendation based on the latest, greatest, and best scientific evidence before us. But the truth of the matter is, first do no harm is our principle. And in an evidence-based review, when you don't have benefit from the existing evidence that you have, and there's always potential for harm with any drug, that is the principle we live by. And that is what led to, in addition to all of the harmful effects around the cost and the difficulty for people to get it, that ultimate recommendation. So I just wanted to explain more detailed the rationale behind that, but to say that will be reevaluated when there's new evidence to evaluate its effectiveness, and that will be in a direct population of people with post-COVID condition, so that the anecdote that you're describing can become evidence.
The review is set for 2026, which is 2 years away. If the committee members suddenly became disabled and couldn't get off the couch, would they be willing to wait 2 years? The other is, it's getting a bit hard to finish recruitment in Vancouver. 4-month trial, you only get a 50% chance of low-dose naltrexone, no crossover, and no prescription at the end. People talk, and if they can find a way to get a prescription instead, that's what they will do. I am so glad that Knighton is doing his trial. I know some of the other people involved. They are decent, good researchers. But to wait 2 years to maybe let people restart their lives, and naltrexone was approved by the FDA 40 years ago in doses 100 times what we're asking to take. And there have been no SAEs attributable to high-dose naltrexone in 40 years in post-marketing surveillance. And it is even recommended by a US, I believe it's CDC Atlanta, I can't remember right now, that if a woman gets pregnant while she's on high-dose naltrexone, she puts herself and the fetus at greater risk if she quits taking it. So that fetus is the most sensitive organism on the planet. And if they're safe on 100 times the dose, I understand your reasons. I live with a scientist. He lived through the AIDS crisis. I remember when AZT came along and it was the only way of saving a life, and people were sharing their doses. They couldn't get valid data at first. But surely to goodness, there's got to be a happy middle ground here that lets us at least try a safe med to see if it makes any difference. And if it doesn't, we're sure as heck not going to keep doing it. Plus, the cost can be ameliorated by going to a liquid formula, way, way cheaper. And most pharmacies are a compounding pharmacy. They can put it together. So it's not that rare to find a compounding pharmacy for this, because they already are prescribing naltrexone. And the instructions from the long COVID clinic at VGH in Vancouver are actually how to buy one pill, grind it up, put it in a set volume of water, and draw it off with a syringe each day, so that you're only paying for one pill every so many weeks or months. So there's ways to save money, so that addresses that issue. You don't even need a compounding pharmacy if that's the way you want to go. And it's not expensive to go that way. And it's a safe drug 6 ways to Sunday. So I would really ask you to review this recommendation, because so many of the other recommendations are fabulous. They're really good. And this is a shining beacon that is a disappointment amongst many fabulous things. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorraine. I'll just finish by saying a conditional recommendation against does not mean that your healthcare provider can't and should not prescribe it to you. So I think, our job is to evaluate the science and make a recommendation. The prescribers need to understand that a conditional recommendation does not mean that they cannot and should not prescribe it. And so a patient comes to them and asks them for it, and they have a careful discussion, then they should be able to access it. The feasibility thing is a major problem. I hear what you're saying in Vancouver, but our colleagues in the Yukon, there are no compounding pharmacies, not one, that they can get low-dose naltrexone in the Yukon. They have to travel to northern British Columbia just to be able to get it. So I think when we look at this, we look at it from a population perspective, and we try to consider everywhere in Canada, not just our urban centers, and the effects on the people if we make the recommendations for or against at that level. So I hope that helps explain things further, and I recognize the discontent with this recommendation, but it needs to wait until further evidence can evaluate whether it works or not.
Thank you so much for that very spirited back and forth. And I think, Lorraine, you brought up a question that certainly is on a lot of people's minds, and we see that a lot in the chat as well. Chris, did you have a question that you wanted to ask? I wanted to give you the opportunity. I didn't want you to stand up and wait, as a patient, an individual with lived experience.
Yes, just a quick comment about that. I am one that is on LDN, and I did get it. But I can certainly say that I've talked to my GP, and she was so completely against it because she's never even heard of it. So, and I guess when, just to touch off a little bit what Lorraine said, I think LDN is an interesting thing because it's been around for 30 years in, the CFS ME community that has been used anecdotally. And the fact that we're trying to get clinical trials now for a drug that's been around that long. And basically it's about who wants to do the research question, because this has been neglected for 30 years because quite honestly, the CFS ME community has been women-dominated patients. So we haven't really gone down that route to actually put in the money and ask for the funding in the first place. So now here we are at the end of the pandemic, trying to catch up, so to speak, on this one drug. And I'm sure there's many more that we could talk about. But I want to give that sociology piece to it too, that, this has been neglected for a long time. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for those comments. I agree. It's been long overdue, and thankfully we have an ongoing trial that I hope will be able to give us some more definitive answers.
Yes, absolutely. And yeah, I think to Chris's background, having that sociology background, I think long COVID really just exacerbated a lot of the fault lines that was already in our community. As a woman, as a person of color, we know how clinical trials have long been inequitable and access issues and barriers for people from different socioeconomic status. And so, yeah, this is definitely a crisis moment that just laid bare all the systemic issues that has, led us to this point. With that, we will bring this session to a close. Thank you so much, Dr. Quinn, again, for taking out the time from your busy clinical schedule. I hope your week goes well. And so we're just so honored that you were able to spend this time with us.
Thank you, everyone.